I'm often asked whether I think the carnivore diet is a good idea. Maybe I'll start with some of its merits, potential merits anyway. Number one would be if you have problems with your blood sugar, if you have type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, it's certainly one of the quickest ways to normalize blood sugar. But is it really something that's sustainable, and is it really something that makes sense long term? I'd say, first of all, you have to reflect on the idea that this is somehow a pattern of eating that was typical in people in the past, and it really isn't. You'd say, well, the Inuit lived on nothing but animal products, but it wasn't the same kind of animals. The Inuit lived on mostly fat, and that fat was very different than the fat you find in animal fat today. The fat was mostly marine mammals and some caribou and so on, and those were animals that had a very different fatty acid profile. For one thing, very high amounts of omega-3 fatty acids, especially in the marine mammals. And then all of these peoples, because getting an animal for food was something that didn't happen every day, probably in most cases, it was something that happened, and then they had to find a way to eat the whole animal. They call it from nose to tail. And I don't think most people that are eating the carnivore diet are eating nose to tail. They're eating the finest cuts within the animal. And that was really not what the traditional diets like the Inuit were eating. Some people point to the Maasai, for instance, and say they're a good example of people who were eating a carnivore diet. But let's be real, when your livelihood is dependent on herding of animals, you're not going to kill those animals very often. So the Maasai mostly lived on blood and milk, and some interesting ways of processing it, like adding urine to the mix so that the whole thing didn't curdle, I guess. It's not the kind of diet that most people would be accustomed to. In the Inuit, they also, for instance, when they down a caribou, the first thing they would typically do would be to open up the animal and eat the organs right on the spot. Usually the beating heart would be the favored thing, and raw, and then they would usually eat the liver raw. Very different nutritional composition of raw animals when you look at what they were getting. They were getting perhaps 15% of their diet as carbohydrate when they ate that, because the glycogen within the liver and the muscles is degraded with cooking, but it's there when you're eating it raw. So it really was even a different macronutrient profile. But I think that the big thing to be concerned about with the carnivore diet has a lot to do with the animals that we're eating today. When you're looking at modern livestock, they're typically animals that are essentially force-fed near the end of their life with diets heavy in corn and soy. They may forage on grass, and you may even be able to get some grass-fed animals, but for the most part, most people on carnivore diets are still looking for that well-marbled muscle. Essentially, it's a type of meat that is in a state very similar to people with obesity today. You're forcing that animal into a state we call metabolic syndrome, where you're essentially eating an animal that died in a state of metabolic syndrome. And there is some concern about that. So an example of how modern agricultural animals are different than what would be typical in maybe a traditional paleo diet, for instance, would be in animals that are fed the way they are today with heavy use of grains and essentially to marble and fatten that animal up. You're going to be dealing with animals that have a lot of what we call advanced glycosylated end products in their proteins. So when you have diabetes, you probably know that you go to the doctor regularly to get a test called the A1C. Hemoglobin A1C is a test that's done to determine how much sugar is stuck to a particular protein that's easy to measure. That's your hemoglobin. You could also do a sample of the muscle of the person with diabetes and look for advanced glycosylated end products similar to glycosylated hemoglobin. But the thing is that these advanced glycosylated end products are essentially proteins that have been transformed by having sugar stuck to them in a very durable way, and that inside your body is where a lot of the harm comes from in terms of elevated blood sugar. There's a lot of concern that when you're eating animals that are made up of these kinds of proteins, these glycosylated proteins, you're actually in a sense eating diabetes when you're eating most of the meat products that are coming from the grocery store today. It doesn't mean you shouldn't eat meat necessarily, but we should be maybe more cautious of the idea that we should be focusing our whole diet on that type of food. I guess if you're on a carnivore diet and you're going out and hunting all your own meat and eating it the old-fashioned way, which means eating the stomach contents, for instance, very, very common, and In more Paleolithic people, they would eat the stomach contents, and that's where they got a lot of vitamins and minerals and things from. So that's the idea that it has its sort of philosophical underpinnings, that this is more like the diet that humans lived on traditionally, it's a bit nonsensical, to be honest with you. It doesn't really reflect in any way, shape, or form what a paleo diet would have been, and what might have led to some absence of certain disease back then. And then, the other side of it is, how old did paleo people live? When you look at, for instance, archaeological studies of the Inuit people, there were occasionally people that lived into their 60s and 70s, looking at things like dental records and skeletal remains and that sort of thing. But really, the most of those people died early in their life. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high. People died of violence. They died from animal attacks. They died from infighting, tribal war and things like that. They died from certain infectious diseases. They died from nutritional deficiencies. And very few actually lived to become truly elder in their population. If you want to look at societies that lived long, you have to look at places where food was abundant and it was very omnivorous. Places mostly around the Mediterranean, places like the island of Icarus off the coast of Greece, or the island of Sardinia off the coast of Italy, or Okinawa, an island south of Japan. And these were people that lived where they had a climate where they could grow foods that were abundant in all sorts of ways. They had lots of vegetables. They had whole grains and legumes and tubers. The longest lived people on the earth that we have record of were the traditional Okinawans, and 80% of their calories came from a traditional sweet potato. You have to say that if we want to look at what reality really says about what diet would really be the diet where humans thrive the best, it would be more of a diet around the Mediterranean areas traditionally, not so much maybe Barcelona today, and still in some rural areas in some of those places. I would say that the carnivore diet is something that is really more of a belief system than it is something that has any scientific merit. Certainly, there's a lot of very strong advocates, mostly medical doctors, that come out with these ideas and purport that they are so great, and they look at the short-term effects on blood tests. But realistically, I think we're looking at a very different scenario today when it comes to carnivore diets. Advanced glycosylated end products or proteins that have sugar glued to them is like eating diabetes. So, really, even eating a chicken today, have you ever seen a brooder chicken, a chicken that's meant for meat? It's a pretty strange sight. I've been to farms where they grow these, and they're these basically blobs that just sit in one place and they waddle over and eat, and then they sit down in a big blob, and in a few weeks they grow up to this plump, delicious chicken. And so even the chicken that we're eating today it's not the same as a chicken you might get if you, for instance, see a chicken in Maui wild and running around. That would be a pretty skinny chicken. Realistically, I think the carnivore diet is I think it's an experiment. It's really a medical experiment. There's a lot of volunteers doing it, and there's probably some short-term benefits for many people, and there may be some circumstances where it might be the best diet for those people. And I'm not going to argue with that people feel better for a while at least, and so on. But I'm guessing that most of the people that are really advocating this carnivore diet, give them a couple decades, because, for instance, atherosclerosis is not a short-term problem. It's a thing that takes decades to progress, and most of these people will probably end up dying of cardiovascular events prematurely. About the decrease in their lifespans you'd see with a heavy smoker, probably that's, if I was to guess what's going to happen with the carnivore diet advocates, we're going to start seeing them drop like flies. Dr. Atkins, just so you know, there's medical records that have leaked out that show that he was repeatedly hospitalized years before his death for heart problems, serious heart problems. He wasn't the pinnacle of health, and he didn't die that old, and he was eating pretty well a carnivore diet, and figured that anything that's not got carbs is good for you, and probably just not true.